The summer heat refused to surrender even at 11:47 at night. Atlanta, baked under a stubborn, high-pressure system that had parked itself over Georgia for the past week, turning the city into a concrete oven where temperatures barely dipped below 85 degrees after sunset. The air hung thick and motionless, carrying the distant hum of air conditioning units working overtime and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere in the manicured neighborhoods of Buckhead. Lieutenant Sarah Collins guided her unmarked Dodge Charger through the winding streets of one of Atlanta's wealthiest enclaves, her window cracked just enough to let Max catch the scents drifting through the heavy air. The Belgian Malinois sat alert in the back seat, his nose working constantly, processing thousands of invisible particles that told stories humans could never read. His ears rotated like satellite dishes, tracking sounds beyond the range of human perception. The radio crackled with routine traffic, a domestic disturbance in Midtown, a possible DUI on Peachtree. Nothing that required their specialized skills. Sarah had volunteered for the late patrol after spending too many restless hours staring at her apartment ceiling, her mind churning through cold cases and unsolved puzzles. Sleep had become an adversary lately, and she found more peace behind the wheel, with Max at her back, than she did in her own bed. She turned onto Tuxedo Road, where mansions sat behind iron gates and privacy hedges, their windows dark at this hour. Old money lived here, the kind that had been in Atlanta for generations, surviving wars and recessions and scandals with their fortunes and reputations mostly intact. The kind of money that bought silence and discretion along with the real estate. Max's behavior changed so suddenly that Sarah felt it before she saw it. The dog went rigid, his body tensing like a coiled spring. A low growl rumbled from his chest, barely audible but unmistakable in its intensity. His nose pointed skyward, tracking something invisible in the darkness above. Sarah killed her headlights and pulled to the curb, her hand moving instinctively to her service weapon. She trusted Max's senses more than any surveillance equipment ever built. If something had triggered his alert response, something was wrong. Then she heard it. A mechanical buzzing like an oversized insect, growing louder as it approached from the east. She scanned the sky through her windshield and spotted it against the stars, a dark shape descending toward a massive Georgian colonial that had been vacant for months, according to neighborhood gossip. The Whitmore estate, people called it, though the family that bore that name had scattered after the patriarch's apparent suicide 6 months ago. The drone was commercial grade, larger than recreational models, its rotors working hard to support whatever payload hung beneath its frame. It descended in a controlled spiral, heading for the rear grounds of the estate. Sarah was out of the car before conscious thought caught up with instinct. She released Max from the back seat, and the Malinois hit the ground running, his powerful legs eating up the distance between them and the estate's perimeter wall. 7 years of training and partnership meant they moved as a single unit, reading each other's intentions through subtle shifts in posture and breath. The wall was 8 feet of decorative stone, but Max found a section where landscaping had created a natural ramp. He launched himself upward, clearing the top with inches to spare, and Sarah followed, using an ornamental iron gate as a climbing frame. She dropped into the overgrown gardens, just as the drone began its final descent toward a flagstone patio 50 yards ahead. Max didn't wait for a command. His prey drive locked onto the mechanical intruder with absolute focus. He accelerated across the lawn, a dark blur against the moonlit grass, and launched himself at the drone just as it hovered 3 feet above the ground, preparing to deposit its cargo. The impact was spectacular. Max's jaws clamped onto one of the drone's landing struts, and his 65 pounds of muscle and momentum brought the entire apparatus crashing down. The rotors screamed in protest, one of them shattering against the flagstones. And then the machine died with the electronic whimper. Sarah reached the scene seconds later, her weapon drawn, her eyes scanning the shadows for any human presence. The estate grounds appeared deserted, but appearances meant nothing in situations like this. She keyed her radio and called for backup, keeping her voice low and professional despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Max stood over his conquest, his tail held high in triumph, but his attention had already shifted to the package that had spilled from the drone's cargo compartment. The impact had torn the cardboard container open, scattering its contents across the pale flagstones. Sarah's flashlight beam found diamonds first, dozens of them glittering like frozen tears against the stone, ranging from what looked like half a carat to stones the size of her thumbnail. They lay scattered in a rough arc, catching the light and throwing it back in prismatic bursts. Then the beam found the hand. It lay palm up among the diamonds, severed cleanly at the wrist, the flesh pale and bloodless in the harsh LED glare. A heavy gold ring adorned the fourth finger, its face bearing an engraved crest that Sarah recognized from society pages and charity gala invitations. The Whitmore family seal, 3 lions rampant above a Latin motto that translated to something about honor and legacy. Sarah's stomach clenched, but her training held. She photographed the scene with her phone, being careful not to disturb any evidence, and completed a wider sweep of the immediate area. 3 small glass vials had also tumbled from the package, their amber contents gleaming like honey in the flashlight beam. She didn't recognize the substance, but the way Max kept his distance from them suggested something chemical and potentially dangerous. Backup arrived in waves, patrol units first, then detectives, then the crime scene technicians with their evidence kits and portable lights. Within an hour, the Whitmore estate had transformed into a hive of law enforcement activity, its abandoned gardens suddenly alive with purpose and urgency. Detective Marcus Webb from Homicide took lead on the scene, his silver hair and weathered face reflecting decades of experience with Atlanta's darkest secrets. He listened to Sarah's account with the patient attention of a man who had learned that the strangest cases often began with the strangest circumstances. The hand belonged to a male, probably middle-aged, based on the skin texture and liver spots. The cut was surgical, precise, made with something far sharper than any ordinary blade. Medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested the amputation had occurred within the last 48 hours, though determining whether the victim had been alive at the time would require laboratory analysis. The ring was the most compelling piece of evidence. If it was genuine, and the detailed engraving suggested it was, then it had belonged to Harrison Whitmore himself, the billionaire real estate developer who had supposedly put a gun in his mouth 6 months ago, leaving behind a suicide note and a fortune tied up in legal battles. But Harrison Whitmore's body had never been recovered. His yacht had been found adrift in the Atlantic, blood staining the deck, but extensive Coast Guard searches had turned up nothing. The death had been ruled a suicide based on the note and the apparent self-inflicted nature of the wounds, but persistent rumors suggested otherwise. Some whispered about massive debts to dangerous people, others spoke of business deals gone wrong, partnerships with cartels and criminal enterprises that had finally come to collect. Sarah stood at the perimeter of the crime scene, Max sitting alert at her side, and watched the technicians work. The diamonds alone represented a fortune, probably several $1 million worth of stones based on their apparent quality. The amber liquid remained a mystery, sealed in evidence bags and destined for the state crime lab. And the hand, that pale and accusing hand, had already been photographed from every angle and placed in a refrigerated container for transport. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, assuming it was spam, but something made her check the screen. You found the first delivery. There will be more. The question is whether you can stop them before the neighborhood learns what their beloved Whitmores really were. Sarah's blood ran cold. She showed the message to Webb, who immediately called for a digital forensics team. But she already knew what they would find. Burner phone, untraceable, probably already destroyed. Whoever was orchestrating this wanted attention, wanted the investigation to proceed, wanted secrets exposed. The drone delivery had been deliberate, a statement rather than an accident. The question was why, and who stood to benefit from destroying the Whitmore legacy. Sarah and Max remained on scene until dawn, painted the eastern sky in shades of coral and gold. The heat was already building again, promising another brutal day, but she barely noticed. Her mind was churning through possibilities, connections, theories that seemed too outlandish to voice, but too compelling to dismiss. She drove home as the city woke around her, the morning commute beginning its daily crawl toward gridlock. Max dozed in the back seat, his energy reserves depleted by the night's excitement. Sarah envied his ability to simply switch off, to let go of the tensions and uncertainties that kept human minds spinning in endless circles. Her apartment felt empty and too quiet. She showered, changed, and was back at the precinct by 9, running on coffee and determination. The case had been officially assigned to homicide, but her role in the initial discovery meant she would remain involved, at least peripherally. And something about this one had gotten under her skin. An itch she couldn't scratch, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit any board she knew. The crime lab's preliminary report on the amber liquid arrived just before noon. The substance was a synthetic compound, chemically similar to fentanyl, but with molecular modifications that made it roughly 20 times more potent. A single vial contained enough doses to kill hundreds of people. The lab technician who delivered the news looked pale, shaken by the implications. This wasn't recreational drug trafficking. This was chemical warfare in consumer packaging. Sarah spent the afternoon digging into the Whitmore family history, pulling records and news archives and financial documents that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Harrison Whitmore had been a pillar of Atlanta society, a philanthropist and business leader whose name graced hospital wings and scholarship funds. But beneath the polished surface lurked hints of something darker. His real estate empire had expanded aggressively in the years before his death, acquiring properties throughout the Southeast and the Caribbean. Many of the acquisitions made little financial sense on paper. Underperforming assets purchased at premium prices, the kind of transactions that might make sense if the goal wasn't profit, but rather moving money across borders. His business partners read like a who's who of international finance, names that appeared in connection with shell companies and offshore accounts. Nothing definitively criminal, but patterns that would make any forensic accountant deeply suspicious. And then there was the matter of his death. The suicide note had been typed, not handwritten, and the forensic linguists who analyzed it had noted subtle inconsistencies with Whitmore's known writing style. The blood on the yacht had been his, confirmed by DNA analysis, but the quantity was inconsistent with the fatal wound described in the official report. Too much for a gunshot, some experts argued, more consistent with torture than self-inflicted injury. Sarah was deep in a financial disclosure document when her desk phone rang. The caller ID showed an internal extension, somewhere in the administrative offices on the 4th floor. Deputy Chief Robert Hawkins wanted to see her. Immediately. The walk to his office felt longer than usual, the corridors somehow narrower, the fluorescent lights harsher. Sarah had dealt with Hawkins before, professional interactions that had always remained cordial, if not warm. He was a political animal, a career administrator who had risen through the ranks more on networking than street performance. But he wasn't known for interfering with active investigations. His office was a study in careful image management, photographs with mayors and governors, plaques from civic organizations, a framed American flag that had supposedly flown over the Capitol building. He gestured Sarah to a chair and closed the door behind her, a gesture that immediately raised her guard. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic doublespeak. Hawkins expressed concern about resources being diverted from priority cases. He questioned whether a K-9 unit lieutenant had the appropriate expertise for a complex financial investigation. He suggested that her involvement might create jurisdictional complications with federal agencies who would inevitably become interested in the drug trafficking angle. Everything he said was technically reasonable. Nothing he said was true. Sarah left his office with the distinct impression that someone very powerful wanted her away from the Whitmore case. The question was, who had the influence to move a deputy chief, and what they were trying to protect? She found Max in the K-9 training facility, running through exercises with one of the younger handlers. The Malinois greeted her with his usual enthusiastic wag, seemingly untroubled by the political currents swirling around their work. Dogs had the right idea, Sarah thought. Focus on the present. Trust your instincts. Ignore the noise that humans created to confuse themselves. Her phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. Check the property records for 1847 Ashford Lane. Then ask yourself why a dead man needs a safe house. Sarah should have reported the message immediately. Protocol demanded it. Instead, she memorized the address and deleted the text, a decision that would either prove inspired or catastrophic. Someone wanted her to dig deeper, was feeding her information that could crack the case wide open. The source was unknown, potentially compromised, possibly even the perpetrator playing games. But the alternative was walking away, letting the Whitmore secrets remain buried under layers of money and influence. She had never been good at walking away. The address led to a modest ranch house in an unassuming neighborhood east of the city, the kind of place where middle-class families grilled on weekends and complained about property taxes. It looked nothing like the sort of property a billionaire would own, which was precisely the point. Public records showed the house belonged to a limited liability company registered in Delaware, a state famous for its corporate secrecy laws. The LLC's registered agent was a law firm that represented dozens of similar entities, a dead end designed to frustrate exactly this kind of inquiry. But a deeper search revealed that the property taxes were paid through a trust administered by the same bank that handled the Whitmore family finances. Harrison Whitmore had owned this house, hidden behind layers of legal obfuscation, for nearly 15 years, and according to utility records, someone was still using it. Electric and water consumption had continued uninterrupted since his supposed death, suggesting either a very dedicated house-sitter or something far more interesting. Sarah brought Max and drove out to Ashford Lane as the afternoon shadows lengthened. She parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot, the Malinois ranging ahead with his nose to the ground, reading the invisible stories written in scent on every surface. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people minded their own business and avoided asking inconvenient questions about their neighbors. Sarah noted the security cameras on several houses, standard residential systems that probably recorded more footage of squirrels and delivery drivers than actual criminals. The ranch house at 1847 sat behind a chain-link fence, its lawn neatly trimmed, its windows covered with heavy curtains. A Honda sedan occupied the driveway, its plates registered to yet another shell company. Someone was here, or had been recently. The house was too well maintained for abandonment. Max's behavior changed as they approached. His hackles rose, and a low growl vibrated in his throat. He was alerting on something, his trained response to the presence of controlled substances. Whatever was inside that house, it wasn't just a billionaire's weekend getaway. Sarah circled the property, staying on public sidewalks, noting potential entry points and security measures. No visible alarm system, but that meant nothing in an age of smart home technology. The backyard was enclosed by a higher wooden fence, blocking any view of whatever might lie behind the house. She was about to leave, to return with a warrant and proper backup, when the front door opened. The man who emerged was mid-50s, heavy-set, with the pallid complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. He wore a rumpled polo shirt and carried a trash bag in one hand, the mundane choreography of suburban life. But his eyes swept the street with the practiced alertness of someone who expected trouble, and when they landed on Sarah and Max, they went wide with recognition. He dropped the trash bag and ran. Max was after him before Sarah could issue a command. 7 years of training, translating into instant pursuit. The man made it perhaps 30 feet before the Malinois took him down, not biting but blocking, using his body as a barrier while Sarah closed the distance. By the time she reached them, the man had given up any pretense of resistance. He lay on his back on the neatly trimmed lawn, Max standing over him with bared teeth, whimpering something about lawyers and rights and terrible misunderstandings. His wallet identified him as Gerald Hoffman, a name that meant nothing to Sarah until she ran it through her phone's database access. Former accountant for Whitmore Industries, reported missing 3 days after Harrison Whitmore's supposed suicide. Presumed dead, possibly another victim of whatever had happened on that yacht, except Gerald Hoffman was very much alive, living in a dead man's safe house, and absolutely terrified of being found. The next few hours dissolved into a flurry of procedure and protocol. Sarah called for backup while keeping Hoffman secured on the lawn. Patrol units arrived, followed by detectives, followed by the same crime scene technicians who had processed the Whitmore estate the night before. They were starting to recognize each other, developing the grim camaraderie of professionals who kept encountering the same nightmare from different angles. The search of the house revealed a basement that had been converted into something between a laboratory and a bunker. Sophisticated chemical equipment occupied one corner, the same equipment used to synthesize the amber liquid found in the drone's payload. Another corner held communication systems, servers, and satellite links that suggested global reach. And the walls were covered with photographs, documents, and diagrams that mapped a criminal enterprise of staggering scope. Harrison Whitmore had not been just a real estate developer with shady connections. He had been the architect of a drug trafficking network that stretched from Southeast Asia to South America to Europe, using his legitimate businesses as cover for moving product and money around the world. The synthetic compound was his masterstroke, a designer drug that could be manufactured anywhere with the right equipment and expertise, eliminating the need for traditional supply chains and the cartels that controlled them. Gerald Hoffman had been his money man, the accountant who made the numbers dance and kept the authorities confused. When the network had begun to unravel 6 months ago, when partners had turned greedy and competitors had turned deadly, Hoffman had fled to the safe house with enough evidence to bring down half the power brokers in Atlanta. He talked for hours, first to Sarah and the detectives, then to FBI agents who arrived with the particular urgency of professionals who had just realized a major case had landed in their laps. The story, he told, was a tangled web of corruption that extended far beyond the Whitmore family, reaching into City Hall, the courts, and law enforcement itself. Names emerged, some expected and some shocking. Business leaders who had been secret partners in the trafficking network, politicians who had accepted payments to look the other way, and police officials who had actively protected the operation, warning of raids before they happened, losing evidence that might have led to prosecutions. Deputy Chief Robert Hawkins was on the list. Sarah felt the revelation like a physical blow, even though part of her had suspected something like this from the moment of their uncomfortable meeting. The man who had tried to push her off the case was dirty, had been dirty for years, had helped facilitate a drug operation that was now killing people with synthetic poison. The FBI took custody of Hoffman and his evidence, promising coordination and updates that might or might not materialize. Federal agencies had their own priorities and their own timelines, and local cops often found themselves frozen out of cases they had originated. But for now, the important thing was that the information was secure, beyond the reach of whoever had been protecting the Whitmore network. Sarah drove home in a daze, Max sleeping peacefully in the back seat, unaware of the political earthquake that was about to reshape the Atlanta power structure. The summer heat had finally broken, a cold front pushing through with the promise of thunderstorms, and the first drops of rain were spattering her windshield as she pulled into her parking space. Her phone buzzed. Same unknown number. Well done. But Harrison is still alive, and he's not finished. This time, Sarah didn't delete the message. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of its implications. If Whitmore had survived, if he was still out there, orchestrating deliveries and feeding information to her through anonymous texts, then this case was far from over. The safe house had been a sacrifice. Hoffman served up as a distraction, the network's secrets partially exposed to protect something even more valuable. She needed to figure out what. The next morning brought chaos to the department. News of Hawkins' involvement had leaked, probably from federal sources more interested in headlines than operational security, and reporters swarmed the precinct like sharks drawn to blood. The chief held a press conference, grim-faced and carefully scripted, promising full cooperation with the investigation and swift accountability for any officers found to be compromised. Sarah avoided the media circus, slipping in through a back entrance with Max at her heels. The K-9 unit operated somewhat separately from the main detective divisions, a blessing on days like this when the building hummed with tension and suspicion. Every cop was looking at every other cop, wondering who else might be on that list, whose career and freedom might be the next to evaporate. She found refuge in her small office, surrounded by training schedules and equipment requisitions and the comfortable bureaucratic mundanity of her official duties. Max curled up in his usual spot beneath her desk, his presence a grounding force that helped her think. The anonymous messenger had to be someone inside the Whitmore network, someone with access to information that no outsider could possess. But their motivation remained unclear. Were they a whistleblower, driven by conscience to expose the corruption, a rival using her as a weapon against Harrison Whitmore for their own purposes, or Whitmore himself, playing some elaborate game whose rules she couldn't yet perceive? Her computer chirped with an incoming email routed through the department's secure servers. The sender was listed as a string of random characters, clearly spoofed, but the message had somehow bypassed the spam filters that should have caught it. Attached was a single photograph. The image showed a container ship, its hull marked with registry numbers that traced to Panama. It was docked at what appeared to be a private port facility, concrete piers and industrial cranes visible in the background, and standing on the deck, clearly alive and apparently healthy, was Harrison Whitmore. The photograph was time-stamped 3 days ago. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she printed the image, her mind racing through implications. Whitmore had staged his death, probably with the help of the same corrupt officials now being rounded up by the FBI. He had sacrificed his accountant and his safe house to buy himself time and misdirection, and he was still operating, still running his network, still flooding the streets with synthetic poison that was killing people. But why send her this? Why expose himself to the one cop who had stumbled onto his operation, unless he wanted to be found, unless this whole elaborate game was designed to draw her in, to bring her to him, for reasons that remained terrifyingly unclear? She took the photograph to Detective Webb, who received it with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too many cases take unexpected turns. Together, they began the process of tracing the image, identifying the port, tracking the ship's movements through maritime databases. The vessel was called the Pacific Endeavour, registered to a shell company with ties to the same network of offshore entities that had owned the Ashford Lane safe house. Its official cargo manifest listed agricultural equipment destined for ports throughout the Caribbean and Central America. Its actual cargo, Sarah suspected, was far more valuable and far more deadly. Maritime tracking showed the Pacific Endeavour had departed from the port of Savannah 5 days ago, heading south. Its transponder signal had gone dark shortly after leaving territorial waters, a common trick for ships engaged in illicit activities. But satellite imagery obtained through federal contacts showed it anchored off a private island in the Bahamas, a speck of land owned by yet another corporate maze that ultimately traced back to the Whitmore fortune. Harrison Whitmore had built himself an untouchable fortress, a private nation where no American warrant could reach, where he could continue his operations indefinitely while his former associates took the fall for his crimes. But he had also revealed himself to Sarah, had practically drawn her a map to his hiding place. The question of why haunted her through a sleepless night, through hours of staring at that photograph and trying to divine its sender's intentions. The answer came with the dawn. In another anonymous message, he took something from me. Help me get it back and I will give you everything you need to bring him down. Come alone. Tell no one. Ode 600 tomorrow. The old Pullman yard. It was a trap, obviously a trap. Every instinct Sarah had developed through years of law enforcement screamed that she was being manipulated, drawn into something that would likely end with her body dumped in a shallow grave. And yet, whoever was sending these messages had been right about everything so far. The safe house. Hoffman. Whitmore's survival. They were inside the network, with access to information that no one else could provide. If they genuinely wanted to bring Whitmore down, if their vendetta aligned with her mission, then this meeting might be the breakthrough that could finally end this nightmare. She thought about telling Webb, thought about bringing backup, setting up surveillance, handling this by the book. But the message had been specific. Come alone, tell no one. If the messenger was watching, if they had eyes inside the department, any deviation would end the opportunity. Sarah made her decision as the first light of dawn crept through her apartment windows. She would go. She would take Max, because the Malinois was worth more than a dozen backup officers in close quarters, and she would walk into whatever waited at the Pullman yard with her eyes open and her weapon ready. The old industrial site sprawled across 30 acres of rusting infrastructure and urban decay. Once a major hub for railroad maintenance and manufacturing, it had been abandoned for decades, a ghost of Atlanta's industrial heritage slowly being reclaimed by kudzu and graffiti artists. Developers had grand plans for the site, mixed-use developments and public parks, but for now it remained a wasteland of empty buildings and crumbling tracks. Sarah arrived at 5:45, parking her personal vehicle 3 blocks away and approaching on foot with Max at her side. The morning was grey and cool, the remnants of the previous night's rain still dripping from rusted eaves and broken gutters. Her footsteps echoed off concrete and metal, announcing her presence to anyone who might be listening. She found a single figure waiting beside an ancient locomotive, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and the lean, coiled posture of someone who had seen violence and learned to expect it. She wore expensive clothes that had been worn too long, and her eyes held the flat, assessing gaze of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything. Max growled low in his throat, sensing the danger that radiated from this stranger, but Sarah kept him at heel. Whatever this was, it would not be resolved through force, not yet. The woman introduced herself as Elena Voss, and her story came out in fragments, pieces of a puzzle that gradually assembled into a picture of betrayal and revenge. She had been Harrison Whitmore's partner, not just in business but in everything. They had built the network together, she handling the operational side, while he managed the finances and the political connections. For 15 years, they had been untouchable, moving billions of dollars worth of product while maintaining the facade of legitimate entrepreneurs. Then Harrison had decided he wanted out, or rather, he wanted out without her. He had planned his fake death for months, arranging to sacrifice their most compromised assets while securing his own escape. Elena had been marked for elimination, a loose end to be tied up in the chaos following his disappearance. She had survived the attempt on her life, barely, and had spent the past 6 months in hiding, planning her counterstrike. The drone delivery had been her opening move, a signal to the authorities that Harrison was not dead, that his secrets were not safely buried. Each anonymous message had been another piece of the puzzle, breadcrumbs leading Sarah deeper into the network. And now she wanted a deal. Elena had evidence that could bring down Harrison Whitmore completely, documentation of every crime he had committed, every payment he had made, every body he had buried. She had copied the network's records before fleeing, terabytes of data that federal prosecutors would salivate over. But she needed something in return. Harrison had taken her daughter. Not a child, Eleanor clarified quickly, seeing the concern flash across Sarah's face. Her daughter was 26 years old, a young woman named Natasha who had known nothing of her mother's criminal activities. Harrison had kidnapped her as insurance, a guarantee that Elena would not talk to authorities, that she would disappear quietly into whatever grave he had prepared for her. Instead, Elena had chosen war. She wanted Natasha back, and she wanted Harrison to pay for everything he had done. Sarah could make both happen if she was willing to step outside the boundaries of official law enforcement, to operate in the gray zones where police powers meant nothing and only results mattered. It was an impossible choice. Everything Sarah had sworn to uphold demanded that she refuse, that she arrest Elena on the spot, that she pursue this case through proper channels regardless of how long it took or how many roadblocks appeared. But proper channels had failed. Proper channels had been corrupted by the very people they were supposed to hold accountable. And somewhere on that island in the Bahamas, a young woman was being held hostage by a monster who would never face justice through any conventional means. Sarah asked for proof. Elena provided it without hesitation. A burner phone containing photographs of Natasha in captivity, clearly recent, based on the newspaper visible in one frame. The young woman looked terrified, but unharmed for now. Elena also provided a sample of the evidence she claimed to possess, a single flash drive containing financial records that, even at a glance, revealed transactions worth investigating. The deal they struck was simple in its outlines. If staggeringly complex in its execution, Sarah would help Elena rescue Natasha from Whitmore's island. In return, Elena would surrender herself to federal custody and provide complete testimony against the entire network, including everything she knew about Harrison's operations and his corrupted contacts in American law enforcement. It was the kind of arrangement that could end Sarah's career if it went wrong, the kind that could end her life if it went more wrong. But it was also the only path she could see to justice, the only way to bring down an untouchable man and save an innocent woman caught in the crossfire of her mother's sins. She needed help, even if she couldn't involve official resources, and she knew exactly who to call. The team came together over the following 48 hours, a collection of former military, private security, and retired law enforcement professionals who owed Sarah favors accumulated over years of mutual support. They asked questions because they weren't fools, but they also trusted her judgment and her assessment of the situation. By the time they boarded a chartered aircraft bound for the Bahamas, they numbered 8, plus Max, plus enough weapons and equipment to start a small war. Elena came with them because she was the only one who knew the island's layout and Harrison's security arrangements. She sat apart from the others, clearly uncomfortable in the company of people who represented the system she had spent her career evading. But she answered every question about guard rotations and surveillance systems and the layout of the compound where Natasha was being held. Harrison had converted the island into a fortress, complete with armed guards, drone surveillance, and enough firepower to discourage any casual approach. His compound sat at the island's highest point, a sprawling villa that combined Caribbean luxury with paranoid security measures. Natasha was being held in a guest cottage near the main house, constantly watched but apparently well treated. Harrison needed her alive and presentable, a bargaining chip to be used if Elena ever became a threat. That calculation was about to change. They approached the island at night, using a rigid inflatable boat launched from a fishing vessel hired in Nassau. The crossing was rough, the Caribbean chop-testing even experienced sailors, but they reached the island's lee shore without incident. Max made the transit in stoic silence, his trust in Sarah absolute despite the unfamiliar and unsettling environment. The landing zone was a rocky beach on the island's undeveloped north coast, well away from the patrolled areas around the compound. From there, they faced a 2-mile trek through dense tropical vegetation, navigating by GPS and the occasional glimpse of stars through the canopy. Max took point, his senses far superior to any humans for detecting threats in the darkness. He moved like a ghost through the underbrush, his black fur rendering him nearly invisible, pausing only when he detected something that required human attention. Twice, he alerted on guards patrolling the perimeter, giving the team time to avoid detection and continue their approach. They reached the compound's outer fence just after midnight, local time. The barrier was chain-link topped with razor wire, impressive looking but hardly insurmountable. Motion sensors dotted the perimeter, but Eleanor knew their placement and their blind spots. Gaps in coverage that allowed careful infiltrators to slip through. The team split according to plan. 3 operators would create a diversion at the compound's main gate, drawing guards away from the cottage where Natasha was held. 2 more would neutralize the island's communication systems, cutting Harrison off from outside help, and Sarah, Max, Elena, and 2 others would extract the hostage and secure Harrison himself if the opportunity presented. The diversion began at 12:15. A carefully calibrated escalation of explosions and gunfire designed to simulate a much larger attacking force. Guards rushed toward the main gate, exactly as predicted, leaving the cottage's security reduced to a single man who was quickly and quietly neutralized. Natasha screamed when the door burst open, but Elena's voice cut through her panic, a mother's tone that no amount of stress could disguise. The young woman collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing with relief, and for a moment the whole operation paused while Eleanor held the daughter she had nearly lost. But the mission wasn't over. Harrison Whitmore was still somewhere in that compound, and Sarah had not come all this way to let him escape again. She left Max with Elena and Natasha, trusting the Malinois to protect them if anything went wrong, and moved toward the main villa with 2 operators at her back. The building was massive, a maze of rooms and corridors that could hide a dozen enemies. But the guards had been drawn to the perimeter, and the interior seemed almost deserted. They found Harrison in his study, a palatial room overlooking the Caribbean, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the moonlit sea. He was not alone. 3 armed men flanked him, professionals who had not been fooled by the diversion, who had stayed to protect their principal, regardless of what was happening outside. The standoff lasted perhaps 5 seconds, each side assessing the other, calculating odds and angles and outcomes. Sarah saw Harrison's eyes, calm and calculating, the gaze of a man who had survived worse situations through cunning and ruthlessness. He was already planning his next move, already looking for advantage. She didn't give him time to find it. The firefight was brief and brutal. The operators at Sarah's back were ex-special forces, experienced in exactly this kind of close-quarters violence. Two of Harrison's guards went down in the first exchange, caught in a crossfire that left no room for error. The third managed to wound one of Sarah's team before a precisely placed shot ended his resistance. Harrison himself never drew a weapon. He simply watched the violence unfold with the detached interest of a spectator at a sporting event, his expression revealing nothing of his calculations. When it was over, when his last defender lay bleeding on the expensive carpet, he raised his hands in a gesture of surrender that somehow managed to convey contempt rather than submission. Securing him took less than a minute. Sarah zip-tied his wrists and searched him for weapons, finding none. He submitted to the process with an almost amused compliance, as if this were all a minor inconvenience that would soon be resolved. His first words confirmed her suspicions. "You know this means nothing," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable despite the circumstances. "I have lawyers who will have me out of any jurisdiction within 48 hours. I have documents that will show I was kidnapped, held against my will, forced to confess to crimes I never committed. Your career is over, Lieutenant. You just don't know it yet." Sarah's response was to show him the flash drive Elena had provided, the one containing a sample of the financial records that documented his entire operation. His composure cracked, just slightly, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his features before the mask reassembled itself. "Your partner," she said. "The one you tried to kill. She kept copies of everything, every transaction, every payment, every body. It's already in federal hands, Mr. Whitmore. Your lawyers can't bury evidence they don't even know exists." For the first time, Harrison Whitmore had no clever response. He simply stared at her with the hollow realization of a man who had finally run out of moves. The extraction proceeded according to plan, the team evacuating the island by the same route they had entered. Harrison was transported under guard, his wrists bound and his mouth finally silent. Elena and Natasha clung to each other throughout the journey, mother and daughter reunited against all odds. And Max stayed at Sarah's side, his presence a constant reassurance that she had done the right thing, regardless of what consequences might follow. They reached Nassau before dawn and transferred their prisoner to federal custody at the American Embassy. FBI agents were waiting, alerted by Sarah's contacts, and they took custody of Harrison with the grim satisfaction of professionals who had waited a long time for this moment. Elena surrendered herself as promised, beginning the process that would transform her from fugitive to cooperating witness. The return to Atlanta felt surreal, normal life resuming its patterns while Sarah waited for the storm she knew was coming. She had operated outside every boundary of law enforcement procedure, had essentially organized a private military operation on foreign soil. The fact that she had captured a major drug trafficker and rescued a hostage would matter to prosecutors, but it might not be enough to save her badge. The storm came, but not in the form she expected. Federal prosecutors, faced with the mountain of evidence Elena provided, chose to focus their attention on the network rather than the means by which it had been exposed. Harrison Whitmore and 43 of his associates were indicted on charges ranging from drug trafficking to murder to corruption of public officials. The trials would take years, but the outcomes were never really in doubt. Deputy Chief Hawkins resigned before he could be arrested and was found dead in his garage 3 days later. The official ruling was suicide, but rumors suggested otherwise. The network was collapsing, and those who had depended on its protection were being eliminated by those who feared what they might reveal. Sarah faced an internal investigation that stretched across 3 months of interviews and document reviews. In the end, the department concluded that her actions, while unorthodox, had been justified by the extraordinary circumstances of the case. She received an official reprimand that would remain in her file, balanced against a commendation for her role in dismantling one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the region's history. It was a complicated legacy, but she had learned to live with complications. Life settled into new patterns as summer gave way to autumn. Sarah returned to her regular duties with the K-9 unit, training new handlers and their dogs, running patrols through neighborhoods that seemed somehow safer, knowing that one source of poison had been eliminated. Max remained her constant companion, 7 years old and showing no signs of slowing down, his instincts as sharp as ever. Elena's testimony dominated headlines for weeks, each revelation more damaging than the last. The scope of the Whitmore network's corruption exceeded even the worst estimates, reaching into every level of government and business. Careers ended, fortunes evaporated. The comfortable illusions of Atlanta's elite crumbled under the weight of documented truth. Harrison Whitmore himself became a ghost, a figure glimpsed only in courtroom sketches and old photographs. His lawyers fought every charge with expensive desperation, but the evidence was overwhelming. He would die in prison, everyone agreed. The only question was which prison and how long he would last before the other inmates decided he knew too much. Sarah visited Elena once in the federal facility where she was being held pending her own sentencing. The former drug trafficker looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of her choices, but she thanked Sarah for saving her daughter, for giving her a chance to make things right, and there was genuine gratitude in her voice. Natasha had returned to her life, traumatized but recovering, building something new from the wreckage of her family's secrets. She sent Sarah a card on Thanksgiving, a simple note of thanks that meant more than any official commendation. The city moved on, as cities do. New scandals emerged to dominate the headlines. New crimes demanded attention. The Whitmore case became history, a cautionary tale told to rookies about the corrupting influence of power and money. But Sarah remembered every detail, every moment of that summer when a drone falling from the sky had opened a door to something vast and terrible. She was running Max through his paces at the training facility one cool October morning when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Her heart rate spiked despite herself, old instincts triggered by the familiar anonymity. The message contained only 2 words: "Thank you." Sarah stared at the screen for a long moment, then smiled and deleted the message. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. Some debts were better left unacknowledged. She had done her job, followed her instincts, and emerged from the darkness with her integrity intact. That was enough. Max bounded over to her, tail wagging, ready for whatever came next. Sarah knelt to scratch behind his ears, feeling the simple joy of his presence, the uncomplicated trust that defined their partnership. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The Atlanta skyline glittered in the morning light, a city of secrets and stories, of crimes and consequences. Sarah Collins and Max walked back toward the precinct, 2 figures against the urban landscape, ready for whatever the next call might bring. Above them, somewhere in the clear autumn sky, the distant drone of aircraft engines reminded her of that night in Buckhead, when everything had changed. She looked up briefly, scanning the heavens out of habit, then returned her attention to the ground and the work that waited. The work always waited, and she would always answer. 6 months later, Sarah found herself testifying before a congressional committee investigating the failures of law enforcement oversight that had allowed the Whitmore network to flourish. The hearing room was packed with cameras and reporters, every word scrutinized for political advantage or bureaucratic blame. She told her story simply and directly, without embellishment or excuse. She described what she had seen, what she had done, and what she believed needed to change to prevent similar corruptions in the future. The senators asked their questions, some hostile and some sympathetic, and she answered each with the same straightforward honesty. When it was over, she walked out into a Washington afternoon that felt disconnected from anything real. The marble buildings and manicured grounds seemed to belong to a different world than the streets where she worked, the alleys where Max tracked suspects, the neighborhoods where people lived and died and struggled to survive. Her phone rang with a number she recognized this time, Detective Webb, calling from Atlanta with news of a new case. A series of home invasions in the East Side neighborhoods, possible connection to a larger robbery ring. The K-9 unit's expertise was requested. Sarah boarded the next flight home, leaving the politicians and their hearings behind. There would be more testimonies, more investigations, more attempts to understand how the system had failed so completely. But understanding came later. First came the work. Max greeted her at the airport with his usual enthusiasm, apparently unaware that she had been gone less than 36 hours. She loaded him into her vehicle and headed for the scene of the most recent invasion, where uniformed officers were already securing the perimeter and witnesses were being interviewed. The victims were an elderly couple, shaken but unharmed, their home ransacked by intruders who had known exactly where to look for valuables. The methodology suggested professional burglars with inside information, possibly a crew that had been operating throughout the Southeast for months. Max went to work immediately, his nose processing the scent signatures left behind by the intruders. He tracked through the house and out a back window, following a trail that led through neighboring yards, and eventually to an alley where the perpetrators had apparently loaded their vehicle. The scent dissipated at the curb, diluted by exhaust and time, but Max had provided enough information to significantly narrow the investigation. Sarah photographed the track and documented her observations, adding another piece to the puzzle that detectives would assemble over the coming days. It was routine work, the kind of case that would never make headlines or inspire congressional hearings. But it mattered to the elderly couple sitting in their violated home, waiting for answers that might restore some sense of security. It mattered to the neighborhood, where similar invasions had created an atmosphere of fear and distrust. It mattered because every case mattered, every victim deserved justice, every crime demanded response. Sarah had learned that lesson long ago, and the Whitmore case had only reinforced it. The spectacular busts and dramatic takedowns were rare exceptions. Real police work happened in the margins. The daily accumulation of small victories and minor progress that gradually made communities safer. She would never stop a drug empire single-handedly again. She would probably never testify before Congress again, but she would keep showing up, keep working the cases that landed on her desk, keep trusting Max's instincts and her own judgment. That was the job. That was enough. The evening shift settled into its familiar rhythm as Sarah and Max patrolled the streets of Atlanta. Radio traffic murmured its constant stream of incidents and updates. The city hummed with life around them, millions of people going about their business, most of them never knowing how close they had come to being flooded with a poison that would have devastated their communities. Sarah thought about Harrison Whitmore, sitting in his cell somewhere, stripped of his power and his protection. She thought about Elena Voss, serving her reduced sentence, building a relationship with the daughter she had nearly lost. She thought about all the anonymous victims of the network, the addicts and the dead, the families torn apart by chemicals designed to maximize profit and suffering. She thought about the strange chain of events that had begun with a drone falling from the sky and a dog's instinctive response to something wrong in the night. If Max had not alerted, if she had not been patrolling that particular street at that particular moment, the Whitmore network might still be operating. Harrison might still be living in luxury on his private island. Elena might have died in whatever grave had been prepared for her. Random chance, some would say, luck and circumstance conspiring to produce an outcome no one could have predicted. But Sarah preferred to think of it differently. She preferred to believe that preparation met opportunity, that years of training and partnership had positioned her and Max to recognize something wrong and act on that recognition. The circumstances might have been random, but their response had not been. They had done what they were trained to do, followed where the evidence led, and refused to surrender even when powerful forces tried to push them aside. That was not luck. That was purpose. The radio crackled with a call that pulled her from her reverie. Suspicious activity at a warehouse near the railroad tracks. Possible drug activity. K-9 assistance requested. Sarah acknowledged the call and headed toward the location, Max alert and ready in the back seat. The night stretched ahead of them, full of unknown challenges and opportunities. She would not know until much later that this particular call would lead to a new investigation, a new network of criminals operating in the city's shadows. She would not know that Max would play a crucial role in that investigation, his nose uncovering evidence that human searchers would have missed. She would not know that the lessons learned from the Whitmore case would prove essential in navigating the political and procedural obstacles that would arise. In that moment, she knew only that there was work to be done, and she was ready to do it. Lieutenant Sarah Collins pressed the accelerator and drove toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead. Max watched the city lights flash past the windows, his ears pricked for sounds beyond human hearing, his nose filtering the air for scents that told stories no one else could read. Together, as always, ready for anything. The warehouse district loomed ahead, shadows and secrets waiting to be uncovered. Sarah checked her weapon, confirmed her radio connection, and prepared to step once more into the unknown. This was her city. These were her streets, and she would protect them, one case at a time, one night at a time, for as long as she could serve. The work was never finished, but that was exactly how she wanted it. Max barked once, sharp and eager, as they pulled up to the scene. His tail wagged with anticipation, his body vibrating with readiness. Whatever waited inside that warehouse, they would face it together. Sarah smiled and opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Time to go to work. The warehouse stood against the Atlanta skyline like a monument to forgotten industry, its corrugated walls stained with decades of weather and neglect. Sarah approached with practiced caution, Max ranging ahead with his nose low to the ground, reading the invisible messages left by whoever had passed this way before them. 3 patrol units had already established a perimeter, their officers positioned at strategic points around the building's multiple entrances. The sergeant in charge briefed Sarah quickly as she approached. Multiple reports of unusual activity over the past week. Vehicles arriving at odd hours, sounds from inside that suggested occupancy in a building that should have been empty for years. Max's behavior shifted as they neared the main entrance, his body language transitioning from general alertness to specific focus. He was hitting on something. His trained response to the chemical signatures of controlled substances triggering the characteristic changes in posture and movement that Sarah knew so well. She signaled the waiting officers, confirming what they had suspected. Whatever was happening inside this warehouse, it involved drugs in sufficient quantity to be detectable, even from outside the structure. Probable cause was established. They could proceed. The entry was textbook, officers flowing through the doors in coordinated waves, while Sarah and Max held position until the initial sweep confirmed the building was secure. Then she released the Malinois to work, watching as 7 years of training translated into systematic efficiency. Max tracked through the warehouse's cavernous interior, past rows of empty shelving and abandoned equipment, toward a section that had been recently cleared and cleaned. The contrast was obvious even to human eyes. Dust and debris everywhere except for this one area where the concrete floor gleamed and fresh paint covered the walls. The dog alerted on a section of floor that appeared identical to the rest. But his insistent behavior told Sarah something was different. She called for the forensic team, and they discovered what Max had already known. A trap door, cleverly concealed beneath a layer of concrete dust, leading to a basement that had not appeared on any building plans. The space below was a sophisticated laboratory, smaller than the one they had discovered at Hoffman's safe house, but equipped with similar precision. Someone had been cooking the synthetic compound here, manufacturing the amber death in the heart of Atlanta's industrial zone. The equipment was still warm, suggesting that the operators had fled only recently, probably alerted by the police presence. But they had left evidence behind. Lots of evidence. Packaging materials that would yield fingerprints and DNA, chemical precursors that could be traced to their sources, and a laptop computer hastily abandoned that might contain communications and records linking this operation to larger networks. Sarah felt a familiar chill as she surveyed the scene. The Whitmore organization was supposed to be destroyed, its leadership imprisoned or dead, its operations disrupted beyond recovery. But here was proof that the work continued, that others had stepped in to fill the vacuum left by Harrison's fall. The drug trade was like that, she knew. Cut off one head and two more grew in its place. Arrest the kingpin, and his lieutenants simply promoted themselves. The demand never went away, and where demand existed, supply would follow. But that did not mean the fight was pointless. Every lab they shut down meant fewer doses reaching the streets. Every arrest disrupted operations and created pressure that made the business more difficult and dangerous. Every success bought time, saved lives, demonstrated that society would not simply surrender to those who traded in human suffering. The forensic team worked through the night, documenting every detail of the underground laboratory. Sarah remained on scene until dawn, coordinating with detectives who would inherit the investigation, ensuring that the chain of custody remained unbroken. Max dozed in her vehicle, conserving energy for whatever challenges the new day might bring. She drove home as the morning traffic began its daily crawl, exhaustion finally catching up with her after the long night. But it was a satisfied exhaustion, the fatigue of meaningful work rather than empty routine. Another operation disrupted, more evidence gathered, the slow, steady accumulation of small victories that defined real law enforcement. Her apartment felt welcoming for once, the morning light casting familiar shadows across furniture that had witnessed too many restless nights. Sarah fed Max, showered, and collapsed into bed without bothering to set an alarm. The department would call if they needed her. The cases would wait. For a few hours at least, she could rest. Dreams came, as they often did after intense cases, fragments of memory and imagination blending into narratives that made no sense upon waking, but felt urgently significant in the moment. She saw Harrison Whitmore's face, calm and calculating even in defeat. She saw Elena Voss, surrendering herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally made peace with consequences. She saw the diamonds scattered on that flagstone patio, glittering like stars fallen to earth, and the pale hand that had started everything. Max woke her with a soft whine, his internal clock more reliable than any alarm. The afternoon sun slanted through windows she had forgotten to cover, painting warm rectangles across the bedroom floor. Time to return to the world of the living. She checked her phone and found 17 messages waiting, most of them routine updates about ongoing cases, a few requiring responses she would compose after coffee, and consciousness had fully returned. One message stood out from the rest, marked urgent and sent from Detective Webb's personal phone rather than his official account. "We need to talk, not at the precinct. Meet me at the usual place, 6 p.m. Come alone." The familiar request triggered familiar suspicions. Sarah had learned to trust Webb during the Whitmore investigation, but that trust had limits. She texted back a confirmation while making mental notes of precautions she would take. Backup positioned nearby. Location shared with trusted colleagues. The paranoia that came with surviving situations where trust had been betrayed. The usual place was a coffee shop near the Georgia Tech campus, a location they had used before for conversations that required privacy. Webb was already there when Sarah arrived, hunched over a cup that had long since gone cold, his weathered face showing signs of sleepless nights. He slid a folder across the table without preamble. Inside were photographs, documents, and a printout of financial transactions that Sarah recognized all too well. The same shell companies, the same offshore accounts, the same patterns of movement that had characterized the Whitmore network. Someone had rebuilt it. Not Harrison himself, Webb explained. The former billionaire remained in federal custody, his legal appeals going nowhere, his influence completely severed. But the infrastructure he had created, the systems and connections and methods, those had been picked up by new operators. The warehouse laboratory was just one node in a network that had grown back like kudzu after a forest fire. The new leadership was careful, Webb said. They had learned from Whitmore's mistakes, eliminating the corruption of local law enforcement that had ultimately enabled his exposure. They operated through multiple layers of insulation, using technology and tradecraft that made investigation extraordinarily difficult. But Webb had a source, someone inside the new organization, motivated by grievances that he would not specify, who was willing to provide information in exchange for eventual consideration. The source claimed the network was planning something significant, a major expansion that would flood the southeast with the synthetic compound. Details were fragmentary, but the timeline was measured in weeks, not months. Sarah listened with growing unease. The investigation Webb was describing would require resources and authority beyond anything a local homicide detective could command. It would need federal involvement, multi-agency task forces, the kind of coordinated effort that took months to organize. They did not have months, which was why Webb was coming to her. The K-9 unit operated with a degree of independence that other divisions lacked. Sarah's reputation after the Whitmore case gave her credibility that could open doors, and Max's capabilities made them effective in ways that traditional investigative methods could not match. He was asking her to help build another unofficial operation, to operate once again in the gray zones between what was legal and what was necessary. The request came with no guarantees and significant risks, including the very real possibility that she would face career-ending consequences if things went wrong. Sarah should have refused. Every lesson from the Whitmore case argued for caution, for working within established channels, for letting federal agencies take the lead on threats of this magnitude. She had already risked everything once and survived more through luck than skill. But she thought about the laboratory beneath the warehouse. She thought about the amber compound that killed so efficiently. She thought about all the victims who would never know that their deaths had been preventable if only someone had been willing to act. She told Webb she was in. The following weeks blurred together in a haze of covert meetings and clandestine reconnaissance. Webb's source provided information in irregular bursts, fragments of the larger picture that gradually assembled into something coherent. The new network was headquartered somewhere in the rural areas north of the city, using legitimate agricultural operations as cover for manufacturing and distribution. Sarah and Max conducted surveillance when they could justify the time away from official duties, mapping the territory and identifying potential targets. They worked alone mostly, trusting no one else with knowledge that could compromise the operation. Webb served as their handler, coordinating with the source and gathering intelligence from his own network of contacts. The break came on a Thursday afternoon, when the source revealed the location of the network's main production facility. a former chicken processing plant in Forsyth County, converted to pharmaceutical manufacturing under the guise of a veterinary supply company. The compound was produced there in quantities that dwarfed anything they had seen before, then distributed through a network of delivery vehicles disguised as feed trucks and agricultural equipment. They needed to move fast. The source warned that the network had detected increased law enforcement interest and was preparing to relocate operations. Once they moved, months of work would be lost, and the trail would go cold. Sarah made the call to bring in federal resources, burning channels she had hoped to preserve for true emergencies. FBI and DEA agents mobilized within hours, drawn by the intelligence she provided and the credibility she had earned through the Whitmore prosecution. A raid was planned for the following morning, coordinated across multiple agencies, with enough force to overwhelm whatever resistance the network could muster. Max rode in the lead vehicle as they approached the facility at dawn, his presence both practical and symbolic. The Malinois would be essential for clearing the building and detecting any hidden stockpiles, but he was also a reminder of where this investigation had begun. A dog's instincts, triggered by a drone falling from the summer sky, the raid went better than anyone had dared hope. The network's leadership was present at the facility, caught in the middle of the relocation they had been planning. Resistance was minimal, overwhelmed by the coordinated assault that gave them no time to organize. Dozens of arrests, tons of precursor chemicals seized, equipment and records that would support prosecutions for years to come. Sarah walked through the aftermath with a sense of completion that she had not expected to feel. The Whitmore network was truly dead now, its successor destroyed before it could reach full strength. The synthetic compound would continue to appear on streets somewhere, cooked in other laboratories by other organizations, but this particular threat had been neutralized. Webb found her as the sun rose over the Georgia hills, his face showing the same exhausted satisfaction she felt. They had done the impossible again, operating outside normal channels to achieve results that normal channels could not deliver. The risks had been justified. The sacrifices had been worthwhile. But they both knew this could not continue indefinitely. Sooner or later, their luck would run out, or their methods would be exposed, or the political winds would shift against them. They needed to find another way, a sustainable approach that did not require them to constantly balance on the edge of catastrophe. That conversation would come later. For now, there was paperwork and processing and the mundane aftermath of successful operations. Sarah loaded Max into her vehicle and drove toward Atlanta, watching the rural landscape give way to suburban sprawl and eventually the familiar skyline of the city she protected. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost ignored it, then checked the screen out of habit. "You did well. The network is finished, but there will always be another. Stay vigilant, stay ready. The city needs people like you." Sarah smiled and deleted the message. Anonymous benefactors and mysterious sources were problems for another day. Right now she had reports to file and evidence to catalogue and the endless administrative tasks that followed every major operation. Max settled into the back seat with a contented sigh, apparently satisfied that the work was done and rest was earned. Sarah reached back to scratch behind his ears, feeling the simple connection that had sustained them through so many challenges. The road ahead stretched toward home, toward whatever cases and calls and crises waited in the future. She would face them as she always had, with determination and preparation and the unwavering partnership of the remarkable dog beside her. Lieutenant Sarah Collins and K-9 Max, protectors of Atlanta, guardians of justice, partners in every sense that mattered. The story continued, as it always would, one case at a time, one night at a time, until the work was finally done. But the work was never done, and that was exactly as it should be. The city lights beckoned ahead, promises and problems intertwined in the eternal dance of urban life. Sarah pressed the accelerator and drove toward home, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Max watched the world flow past, content in the present, trusting in the partnership that had never failed them. Together, always. Until the end. 3 months after the raid on the processing plant, Sarah stood before a classroom of police academy cadets, Max sitting at attention beside her. The department had asked her to speak about the Whitmore case, to share lessons learned with the next generation of officers who would inherit the challenges of modern policing. She told them about the drone falling from the sky, about the diamonds and the severed hand and the beginning of everything. She told them about following instincts when procedure said to wait, about trusting partners when evidence said to doubt. She told them about the costs of doing the right thing, the investigations and reprimands and sleepless nights that came with pushing beyond comfortable boundaries. But mostly she told them about Max. She told them that the best partner she had ever had was not human, that 7 years of working with the Malinois had taught her more about trust and loyalty and perseverance than any training manual ever could. That the bond between handler and dog was something almost mystical, a communication that transcended words and operated on levels that science could only partially explain. The cadets listened with the eager attention of people who still believed they could change the world. Some of them would wash out before graduation. Others would spend their careers pushing paper and counting days until retirement. But a few, maybe, would carry something from this conversation into their own partnerships, their own cases, their own moments of decision when the right path was not the easy path. After the lecture, one cadet approached with a question that cut through all the official talking points. "How do you keep going?" the young woman asked. "When you know the bad guys will never really be defeated, when every victory just clears the way for the next fight, how do you find the motivation to keep showing up?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. She thought about Harrison Whitmore in his cell, about Eleanor Voss rebuilding her life, about all the anonymous victims whose names would never make headlines. She thought about the warehouse laboratory and the processing plant, and the countless other operations she had helped disrupt over the years. "You focus on what you can control," she finally said. "You save the people you can save. You stop the crimes you can stop. And you trust that every small victory adds up to something larger, even if you never see the whole picture." The cadet nodded, apparently satisfied, and Sarah wondered if the words would mean anything when tested against reality. Idealism was easy in a classroom. Maintaining it on the streets, faced with the endless capacity of humans to harm each other, was something else entirely. But that was the job. That was always the job. To hold on to hope in the face of evidence, to believe in justice when injustice seemed triumphant, to keep fighting even when the odds said surrender was the only rational choice. Sarah walked Max through the academy grounds as the afternoon shadows lengthened, enjoying a rare moment of peace between crises. The Malinois moved with the easy confidence of an animal who knew exactly who he was and what he was meant to do. 7 years old and showing no signs of slowing down, his instincts sharp, his dedication unwavering. They had been through so much together, the cases and the criminals, the victories and the setbacks, the long nights and the uncertain mornings. Through all of it, Max had been her constant, her anchor, her partner in the truest sense of the word. How much longer could they continue? The question haunted her sometimes, in the quiet moments when she allowed herself to think about the future. Police dogs aged faster than their handlers, their working lives measured in years rather than decades. Someday Max would slow down, would require retirement, would leave her to face the job without his remarkable capabilities at her side. But that day was not today. Today they were still a team, Still effective, still the best K-9 unit in the department by any measure that mattered. The future would take care of itself. The present demanded attention. Her phone buzzed with a message from dispatch. Armed robbery in progress. Suspects fleeing toward the warehouse district. K-9 assistance requested. Sarah acknowledged the call and broke into a jog toward her vehicle, Max matching her pace with eager anticipation. The familiar adrenaline flooded her system, sharpening her senses and focusing her thoughts. Another case, another chance to make a difference. They reached the scene in minutes, finding patrol units in pursuit of a vehicle that had crashed into a loading dock. 2 suspects had fled on foot into the maze of alleys and abandoned buildings that characterized this part of the city. Max was out of the vehicle before Sarah had fully stopped, his nose already working the air for the scent signatures of the fleeing criminals. He locked onto a trail almost immediately, leading Sarah through a gap in a fence and into the shadowed spaces between buildings. The first suspect they found crouched behind a dumpster, apparently hoping the shadows would conceal him. Max's alert brought Sarah to the spot, and the man surrendered without resistance when he saw the dog's bared teeth. The second suspect proved more difficult. He had climbed onto a fire escape, ascending toward the roof of a 4-story building. Sarah followed while backup officers secured the first arrest, trusting Max to track from ground level while she pursued from above. The rooftop chase ended at the building's edge, where the suspect stood contemplating a jump to an adjacent structure. The gap was perhaps 15 feet, survivable for someone athletic and desperate. Sarah approached with her weapon drawn, Max circling below to cut off any ground-level escape. She talked the man down eventually, using the calm and patient voice that she had learned worked better than threats in most situations. He was young, barely out of his teens, and the desperation in his eyes suggested circumstances beyond simple criminal inclination. Not that it mattered for purposes of the arrest. Whatever had driven him to armed robbery would be sorted out by courts and social workers. Her job was simply to bring him in safely. The arrest completed without further incident, and Sarah found herself once again drowning in paperwork and procedure, reports to file, evidence to catalogue, interviews to conduct, the glamorous work of law enforcement that television never showed. But somewhere in the tedium, she found satisfaction. Another case closed, another small victory in the endless war against chaos. The machinery of justice grinding forward, imperfect but persistent, doing what it could with the tools it had. Max slept at her feet as she typed, his breathing slow and steady. His body finally relaxed after the excitement of the chase. Tomorrow would bring new calls and new challenges. Tonight, there was only the quiet company of her partner and the knowledge that they had done their job. The Atlanta night hummed outside her window. Millions of lives intersecting in the complex dance of urban existence. Somewhere out there, crimes were being planned and committed. Somewhere out there, victims were suffering and perpetrators were calculating their next moves. The darkness never fully retreated, never completely surrendered to the forces of law and order. But neither did the light. Sarah finished her reports and gathered her things, rousing Max from his slumber with a gentle touch. Time to go home, to rest, to prepare for whatever tomorrow would bring. They walked through the quiet precinct together, partners in the truest sense, bound by years of shared experience and mutual trust. The night shift officers nodded as they passed, acknowledging the K-9 team with the respect earned through countless successful operations. Outside, the city waited in its complicated glory, beautiful and dangerous, promising and threatening. The place Sarah had sworn to protect, with all its flaws and all its potential. She loaded Max into her vehicle and drove toward home, the streets familiar even in darkness, the route memorized through countless repetitions. The radio murmured its constant stream of incidents and updates, the heartbeat of law enforcement that never truly fell silent. Tomorrow would bring new cases and new challenges. Tomorrow would test her skills and her judgment and her commitment to the job she had chosen. But tonight, there was only the road ahead, and the partner beside her, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Lieutenant Sarah Collins smiled as the city lights reflected in her windshield. The story never really ended. It just paused between chapters, gathering strength for whatever came next, and whatever came next, she would be ready. They would be ready, together, as always, until the very end. A year passed, marked by seasons and cases and the steady accumulation of experience that transformed good officers into great ones. Sarah's reputation had grown beyond the department, drawing attention from federal agencies and training academies that wanted to learn from her methods. She declined most of the offers, preferring the streets of Atlanta to the lecture halls and conference rooms where careers were made through networking rather than performance. Max turned 8, an age when many working dogs began to show the wear of their demanding profession. But the Malinois remained sharp, his instincts undiminished, his enthusiasm for the work as strong as it had been in his younger years. The department veterinarian pronounced him remarkably healthy for his age, noting that the bond between handler and dog often extended the animal's effective working life. Sarah believed that was true. She had seen it happen before, dogs that pushed beyond their physical limits because they could not bear to leave their partners. The loyalty worked both ways, humans and animals drawing strength from each other through connections that defied scientific explanation. The anniversary of the drone delivery case came and went without fanfare. Sarah marked it privately, reviewing the files and photographs from that remarkable summer, remembering the moments that had changed everything. Harrison Whitmore remained in prison, his appeals exhausted, his fortune forfeited, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the corruption of power. Elena Voss had been released early for good behavior and her cooperation with ongoing investigations. She had reconnected with her daughter Natasha and was apparently attempting to build something legitimate from the wreckage of her former life. Sarah wished her well, understanding that redemption was possible for those genuinely committed to change. The synthetic compound that had once threatened to flood the streets had largely disappeared, its manufacturing disrupted and its distribution networks destroyed. Other drugs filled the void, as they always did, but the specific nightmare that Harrison Whitmore had created had been effectively contained. Small victories, Sarah reminded herself. That was all anyone could hope for. The war never ended, but individual battles could be won. Summer returned to Atlanta with its characteristic intensity, the heat rising from concrete and asphalt in shimmering waves that distorted the urban landscape. Sarah and Max worked the night shift when possible, avoiding the worst of the temperatures while still responding to the calls that never stopped coming. One particular evening, they were patrolling the West Side neighborhoods when dispatch reported a disturbance at a construction site. Security guards had spotted intruders on the property, possibly connected to a series of equipment thefts that had plagued the area for weeks. The site was a massive development project, several acres of excavations and partially completed structures that would eventually become mixed-use commercial space. In its current state, it was a maze of shadows and hazards, perfect for those who wished to operate unseen. Max tracked the intruders through the site with practiced efficiency, his nose leading them past piles of building materials and around deep excavations. Sarah followed with her weapon drawn, alert for any sign of ambush or trap. They found the thieves loading copper wire into a van parked behind a temporary barrier. 3 men, working quickly, their attention focused on the valuable metal that would bring premium prices from unscrupulous recyclers. The arrest was complicated by the terrain, suspects scattering in different directions through the construction maze. Max pursued one, while Sarah coordinated with backup officers to corral the others. The chase ended when the Malinois cornered his target in a partially completed elevator shaft, the man's desperate escape route blocked by the dog's unwavering presence. routine work by any objective measure. Property crime rather than violent felony. Suspects who would likely receive minimal sentences for their offenses. But it still mattered. Every arrest sent a message that crime had consequences. Every successful operation made the city marginally safer for the people who lived and worked there. Sarah processed the paperwork with the mechanical efficiency of long practice, her thoughts already turning to the next call. The radio continued its constant murmur, incidents and updates, and the occasional emergency that demanded immediate response. Around midnight, a call came through that changed everything. Officer down. Shots fired, multiple casualties reported at a location in the industrial district. Sarah responded with lights and sirens, Max alert in the back seat, both of them sensing the gravity of the situation. Officer down calls were the worst, the moments when the danger of police work became terrifyingly real. The scene she found was chaos and tragedy. A routine traffic stop had escalated into a gunfight, leaving 2 officers wounded and a suspect dead in the street. Ambulances screamed toward hospitals while additional units secured the perimeter and began the grim work of documentation. Sarah knew one of the wounded officers, David Chen, a 10-year veteran who had worked alongside her on several K-9 operations. He was conscious when the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance, his face pale but determined, his voice steady despite the bullet wound in his shoulder. "Tell my wife I'm okay," he said as they closed the doors. "Tell her I'm coming home." Sarah promised she would, though she knew such promises meant little in the face of uncertain outcomes. Police work was dangerous, and even the best officers could fall victim to a moment's bad luck or a suspect's desperate violence. She remained on scene for hours, assisting with the investigation and providing support to the other officers processing what had happened. Max stayed close, sensing her distress, offering the wordless comfort that only animals could provide. David Chen survived. The bullet had missed major arteries, and skilled surgeons repaired the damage with minimal complications. He would spend months in recovery and rehabilitation, but he would return to active duty. He would see his wife and family again. Not all officers were so fortunate. Sarah had attended too many funerals, stood beside too many flag-draped coffins, offered too many condolences to families whose loved ones would never come home. It was the reality of the profession, the risk that every officer accepted when they pinned on the badge. But it never got easier. It was never supposed to get easier. She visited David in the hospital a week later, bringing flowers and the good wishes of their colleagues. He was already impatient to return, frustrated by the limitations of his injured body, eager to resume the work that defined his life. They talked about the job, about the risks and the rewards, about why they continued despite everything. David spoke of his family, his wife and 2 daughters, who deserved a father who came home safely every night. He spoke of the fear he had felt in that moment of violence, the certainty that he might be about to die, and he spoke of determination, of the refusal to surrender to the darkness, of the commitment to keep fighting for something larger than himself. Sarah understood. She had felt the same things, faced the same fears, made the same choices. It was what bound them together, all the officers who put on uniforms and walked into danger. A shared understanding that transcended rank and specialty and department politics. She drove home that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. The job was hard, the job was dangerous, but the job mattered, and the people who did it deserved to know that their sacrifices were not forgotten. Max sensed her thoughtful mood and remained quiet during the drive, his presence a comfort that required no words. They had been together for so many years now, through so many challenges. The partnership had shaped them both, creating bonds that would last long after their professional work was done. Summer faded into fall, the Atlanta heat gradually yielding to more temperate weather. Sarah and Max continued their patrols, their investigations, their endless pursuit of the justice that remained always just out of reach. Cases came and went, some successful and some frustrating. The typical rhythm of police work that oscillated between boredom and terror with little warning. The department announced a new initiative for community policing, assigning officers to regular beats where they could build relationships with residents and address problems before they escalated into crises. Sarah volunteered for the program, seeing an opportunity to use her skills in new ways while maintaining her K-9 partnership. Their assigned area covered several neighborhoods in southwest Atlanta, communities that had seen decades of disinvestment and were only now beginning to recover. Crime rates remained higher than the city average, but there were signs of hope, new businesses opening, community organizations forming, residents who cared about their neighborhoods and were willing to work for change. Sarah and Max became familiar figures on those streets, known by name to shopkeepers and residents who had learned to trust them. The work was different from what she had done before, less focused on dramatic arrests and more concerned with building the relationships that prevented crime from taking root. She learned stories she would never have heard through traditional policing, families struggling with poverty and addiction, young people torn between legitimate opportunities and the quick money of illegal enterprises. Elderly residents afraid to leave their homes because the streets no longer felt safe. And she saw Max connect with the community in ways that surprised even her. The Malinois, trained for aggression and pursuit, proved equally capable of gentleness when the situation required it. Neighborhood children who had been taught to fear police dogs learned to approach him carefully, discovering that the fierce guardian could also be a patient companion. These moments mattered, Sarah realized, perhaps more than the arrests and the investigations that had defined her earlier career. Every positive interaction between police and community built trust that would pay dividends in future crises. Every child who learned to see officers as helpers rather than threats was a step toward the kind of society they were supposed to protect. The work was never finished. The challenges remained immense, but progress was possible, one relationship at a time, one neighborhood at a time, one day at a time. That was enough. That had to be enough. Lieutenant Sarah Collins walked her beat with Max at her side, greeting the people they served and protected, building the connections that made communities work. The story continued, as it always would, one interaction at a time, one moment at a time, and somewhere in the distance, a drone hummed against the autumn sky, carrying packages to destinations unknown. Sarah watched it pass without concern. Whatever secrets it carried, she and Max would be ready when they were revealed, together always. That was the promise they had made to each other and to the city they served. That was the promise they would keep until the very end and whatever came after.